Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He is offering his debut novel, The Wolves and the Greyhounds, no other than Mr. Robert Schreiner.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Robert, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Yes, thank you. I am Robert Schreiner, and I am a security consultant by trade, but I'm also an amateur military historian and an author. And I live in Tennessee, in the USA, and The Wolves and the Greyhounds is my first novel.
Mr. Robert, thank you so much for sharing your talents to the world. So, what is the central theme of The Wolves and the Greyhounds?
The novel is inspired by an actual true story that happened at the beginning of the First World War. The At that time, the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, was still arguably the world's great naval power and controlled much of the world's oceans. But Germany was attempting to rival the Royal Navy in that capacity, and the Imperial German Navy, the Kaiserliche Marine, they had various outposts around the world, and their largest foreign naval base was actually in Tsingtao, China, the German colony there. And as war was about to be declared, the British Royal Navy knew that they needed to do something to counter the threat posed by the German fleet based in Tsingtao. So they sent a task force up there from Hong Kong to Tsingtao to try to bottle up the colony and keep the naval assets in there. But when they got there, the entire port was empty. All of the German ships, all of their support vessels, all the warships had left the base and steamed out into the Pacific, and they disappeared, which then prompted a worldwide search by the Royal Navy to try to find the rogue German squadron. And this book follows those events and what happened what happened to that German naval contingent and what happened when they actually finally met the Royal Navy in battle. And so that's what this novel is all about.
How does the novel depict the emotional and psychological impact of the Great War?
Well, that's a good question. The When we think of the First World War, most people think of the war in Europe, trench warfare. You think of All Quiet on the Western Front, the trench warfare in France and in Belgium, and the Eastern Front, the Western Front, the terrible battles between Germany and Russia. But it really was a global war, and there were naval battles that were taking place far, far away, including the ones depicted in this novel. And one of the the impact that I tried to convey in this book was just how isolated these people felt. They were very far from home. And this was long before the era of voice to voice radio that didn't exist yet. There was no way for them to simply call home. Most of the communications were done by letter or sometimes cable telegraph if they could make landfall at a port. And so most of the people who were assigned to these vessels, these warships, whether they were British or whether they were German, they would spend months or years without ever hearing their loved ones' voices. They would be able to exchange letters sometimes when they were in a friendly port of call. But that sense of isolation and that distance that they felt from their homeland was a very powerful thing.
Very well said. Very well said, Mr. Robert. And who are the primary characters in the story and how are they affected by the war?
The primary characters, the book follows primarily two captains. One is British and one is German. The British captain, John Luce, uh, his character is based on an actual real person who was assigned, John Luce is assigned to patrol South American waters. And it was a relatively quiet assignment before the war began. And he gets swept up in this search for the German ships and is, and becomes a integral part of that search and then the ultimate battles that take place. The other primary character is a German captain, Julius Merker, and he was newly assigned to the German squadron in Tsingtao when the war broke out. And he had a very new command. He was in charge of a ship. He was still getting to know all of his officers and men, and suddenly found himself at war, not only at war, but then detached from all of the communications because this squadron that he was assigned to steamed out into the Pacific. They had to be on their own for months at a time. And so it follows him as well as and he follows an admiral who's in charge of the squadron, who leads their ships on this amazing odyssey across the Pacific. And he really is caught up in this, and at times doesn't always agree with all of the things that the admiral wants to do. And so he's a loyal, sailor, and he wants to follow orders. So that sense of isolation that I talked about previously is a big part of it for both of these captains, but also the fact that their duty calls them to do battle with their foes in a place that you'd never even think they would meet up and out in the Pacific Ocean. So that was a big part of this book and how these characters come together.
How does the title, The Wolves and the Greyhounds, symbolize in the context of the novel?
It represents both sides. The British Navy, the Royal Navy, was extremely concerned about the German squadron. They were called the East Asia Squadron, and they were one of Germany's most elite naval groups. They were very well regarded and very dangerous. And at the beginning of the war, there were standing orders from Germany's Kaiser that any German warships that were assigned to foreign stations, whether it was in Asia or Africa or wherever they might happen to be, their job was to attack any Allied merchant ships that they could find. And so to cut off the flow of goods and material to the Allied war effort. And in that capacity, they were really looked upon as wolves after sheep. They were, a very dangerous fighting force that could certainly overwhelm merchant shipping and cargo vessels and all that type of a thing. So that's the wolves part. And then the Greyhounds refers to the ships on the British side that were ultimately sent to do battle with this German squadron. They were a type of battle cruiser they were referred to as Greyhounds because they were very fast and very powerful. And so that's really where the title of the story comes from.
How did you balance historical accuracy with the fictional elements?
That was a big challenge. Even before I started to work on the novel, I had to do a lot of research. The adage is write what you know, but no one living today was a World War I naval officer. And so, although I have some background in military analysis, and I certainly had some knowledge, I really wanted to become an expert in the subject. So for about 3 years, all I did was research this subject. I researched, as much as I could get my hands on. I had amazing help from people all over the world, including people, the Royal Naval College and the Stanford University and UCLA, and places that really were very useful and very helpful to me. And I was able to get just amazing information from sources from all over the world, including ship's logs and letters home from officers, both on the British side and the German side, and accounts of the battles, and amazing old photographs. And some of these accounts and personal journals, some of these things had been sitting on dusty shelves for nearly a century without anybody really looking at them. And so I was able to get all of this historical background, and then my task was to create this fictional account that I wanted to do justice to the actual events. I wanted, because some of these characters were inspired by real people, I wanted to make sure that their legacy was honored by this book, that I did a good thing by portraying them in this way. And so for me, that was a big challenge, is, because although I had all of this amazing historical background information, we still don't know exactly what was said with people and what they were thinking at the time. And so I really had to fill in those gaps. And how would it feel to suddenly be set upon in the open ocean by a squadron of enemy warships? And how would it feel to know that your comrades just sank in the ship that was part of your squadron? I really struggled with that, to make sure that I could do justice to the real people about whom this story was, who inspired this story.
What role does camaraderie play among the characters during the war?
It was crucial. I mean, camaraderie is, anyone who has served in the military certainly in any combat circumstance will tell you that uh, the people that you serve with, that you are standing beside or fighting beside, they really are truly your brothers in arms, and you rely on them with your very life. And that was no different a century ago in the First World War. It was the camaraderie and the esprit de corps that these people felt was, in some cases, the only connections they had to other people that was really tangible. Their families and homelands were far, far away, and the morale aboard these ships would ebb and flow depending on what happened. I mean, they would fight terrible weather and deprivations when they ran out of supplies and food, and all of those things would affect morale, and morale affects camaraderie. And so it was critical. In many cases, the teamwork that they had to display, and they had to come together under extraordinary circumstances, and during these battles and during times of extreme hardship.
How are the opposing sides of the conflict portrayed in the novel?
I tried to be as balanced as possible. As I was doing the research, I realized that there wasn't really a good guy or a bad guy. In a lot of stories, you have a definite good guy and you have a definite bad guy, and you as the reader invest yourself in the protagonist, and you want to cheer for the good guys to win. But in this particular case, these opposing sides were fighting a war that neither of them, these men didn't start this war, but they were going to fight it on behalf of their countries. And I didn't want it to be lopsided. I wanted to be able to tell this extraordinary story from both sides, because it really was an extraordinary story. The odyssey that the German ships went on was something that was unprecedented at the time, and they were far from home and really didn't have any support, and yet they were feared across the globe at this time by the Royal Navy. And on the British side, they were realizing that all of a sudden there was a threat out there that they really didn't know how to match, and they didn't know where they were, and they had to protect their assets. And so I really wanted to tell this story from both sides. And so the book is actually structured that way. Most of the book is alternating chapters telling first the British point of view and then the German point of view, then the British point. So we go from ship to ship, back and forth. And only in the sections of the book where there were actual battles do I mix that up into to the point where it's kind of sections within a chapter where it goes back and forth and back and forth. And I really wanted to tell that story from two perspectives. Partly, one of the things that I found, which was really fascinating in my research, was that the same story was told by different people, and there were very different perspectives on the same events. And it's similar to if a policeman interviews witnesses to a crime, and if he interviews 3 or 4 people, he's going to get 3 or 4 different views of the same event. Well, that certainly happened then too. So the same battle where I found an account written by one person who might have been German, who was on one ship, and another account written by someone who was on a British ship, their perspectives were potentially very different. And so as the author, I had to determine a path in the story that did justice to both views. And in some cases, as the reader, you'd be able to see that even happening at the same time, the views of one side are very different than the views of the other side. And so I tried to balance that as much as I could.
So, Mr. Robert, what will be your advice for those aspiring writers out there want to write historical fiction?
Well, I think that the first thing would be to get your research right. Historical fiction is a wonderful artistic medium, and there's so many great stories and amazing periods in history that are great settings for stories and to be able to convey a story. But it really matters for the authenticity of the story and to the believability for the reader to really feel immersed in what's going on. The author really needs to get their research right. And so I think that doing that research and understanding the time period, and that can be all kinds of things. It can be the technology that was available at the time. As I said, in this particular book, this was before the era, these ships, they didn't have radar. They did not have voice-to-voice radio. They were actually still powered by coal-fired steam engines. They had to load coal onto these ships and burn coal as their primary fuel. And so understanding the technology, understanding the politics of the time, understanding in some cases the language or the geographic delineations at the time. Some the borders in a fiction historical time are likely different than they are today. So for the authors who are aspiring to write historical fiction, definitely getting the research right at the beginning is a key part.
So, what is your short-term and long-term goals in writing historical fiction?
I would love to write more historical fiction. I've got another couple books that are in the works, and at this it's a real passion of mine. I love to be able to tell a good story, and there are fascinating periods of history that a work of fiction can bring to life in some ways even more clearly than a work of nonfiction, because you can get into the characters' minds and their motivations in a way that a nonfiction account can't always do. And so I definitely would like to write more books, and I'm working on those as we speak.
Good luck for your goal, Mr. Robert. And we are looking for more empowering fictional, historical fictional novel. So, to sum up our discussion, how does the ending of the novel tie together the personal and historical elements of the story?
I think that the readers will find that it's a satisfying ending. I did, as I said before, I wanted to stay as true to the actual historical events as I could. And for unfortunately, not everybody survives this story, and so that was just the reality of the time. And so I think that I did make a concerted effort to make sure that the ending was a satisfying and appropriate way to honor those characters and to actually reflect the historical events. And I think that I hope I pulled it off. I think that I pulled it off in a way that is not only accurate but also fulfilling to the reader. And so I'm hoping that the readers will enjoy not just the book, but the ending and and hopefully they've learned something along the way about this era and this time period.
Mr. Robert Freiner, thank you so much again for sharing your historical fiction to the world. And as I said, we are looking forward for more historical fiction books to come. So, Mr. Robert, can you please invite our listeners to support your book?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Yes, if you can find me at robertschreiner.com, and all of the links are there, and this book is available at pretty much anywhere that you buy your books in paperback or ebook format. So thank you very much, Daniel, for the opportunity.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Robert Schreiner because if you support him, as I said, more historical fiction books to come. So, Mr. Robert, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon. I'm gonna share to you the link after my interviews. I think I have 7 more interviews.